All right, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This is lecture 22, part 1. We're going to start talking about mobile phones and tablets as they were introduced in the HD era. We're talking roughly the period now 2005 to 2012. So just about 15, 16 years ago at this point. Or excuse me, 13 years ago at this point for the iPhone. Well, what happens is with the release of the iPhone in 2007, at this point, most people have switched over from what were the cell phones, the flip phones, the Razor phones and stuff, to smartphones. And many people have chosen the Apple iPhone. Smartphones are basically small computers. They allow multiple functionality, so you can have games, apps that do almost everything, right? You can do your work on an app now. You can take pictures of your lunch and send it to your friends. You can do your taxes on an app through an app, play music, movies, videos, games, consume media, read books. I mean, it's almost endless. So again, this is now the standard by 2020, and that's a really fast change. I mean, if you imagine the technology curve used to be about 30 years to adopt new technology, so this did it in about half that time. And again, if in today's world, if you have a flip phone or a kind of like old school cell phone, the question is whether or not what kind of crime you're committing and how fast you're going to throw it in the river, sort of thing. Unless you choose not to have one, which is fine. I'm just sort of teasing there. The mobile gaming market was about $63 billion 2 years ago in 2018. It's about 53, 56% of the market now. It's over half the game industry at this point. It's just so big. There are literally, you know, I think I can't even remember the exact number, but something like a billion iPhones floating around, and every one of them's got a credit card attached to it. So it is just the single biggest part of the game industry at this point. The iPad came out in 2010, which was the first successful tablet device. This was something the PC industry had been looking for a long time. It was sort of like almost like a Star Trek smart data tablet. Sort of almost like an old clipboard style with a stylus kind of thing. But the iPad did it very well. So yeah, there's another new market for games. So one of the things I wanted to show you is 2 years into the Apple's life cycle, the mobile gaming market, the portable market. So this is your Sony PSP and your Nintendo DS that we talked about a couple lectures ago. The Nintendo DS was about 70% of the market. PSP was 11, and iOS and Android were like just less than 20. It was within 2 years, the portable game market was over almost 60%. The smartphones, look at Nintendo's share here, cut almost in half, and then the PSP just starts sort of fading out pretty quickly at this point. Apple iOS and Google Android accounted for 58% of portable gaming revenue in 2011. Tablet-based gaming it was exploding as this era came to an end, and mobile gaming just kept growing and growing as this era wore on. So mobile phones and tablets quickly became sort of the biggest part of the game market overall, though not necessarily the most profitable. So we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So you see here, if you remember from the beginning of the semester, we had a triangle that was arcades, consoles, and PC. By the sort of towards the, with the introduction of smartphones around 2007, the arcades at this point are essentially dead for all intents and purposes. I mean, they still exist, but they're a very niche part of the industry. And mobile has sort of come to the top. So now the mobile space that's dominated by casual games is really the biggest part of the industry, followed by PC and then by game consoles. One of the things I wanted to show you here, we talked about how crazy the Wii sales were in the first 2 or 3 years of its launch. But look at the Apple iPhone, this red line by comparison. It is much faster. These iPhones got adopted so quickly, and they just became part of everybody's life. I think when they look back, 20 or 30 years from now, the iPhone is really going to be something, or smartphones in general is going to be something like radio, like television, like mass media. That's really going to be seen as something that fundamentally changes culture. And so it'll be interesting to see how that looks a little bit farther down the road. Over time, smartphones and the iPhone really started replacing a bunch of other electronic devices. Ben Cousins will refer to this when he talks about when the game consoles die, what comes next, which is your assignment for this week. But you see the iPhone replaced all these portable music players and Kindles and calculators and sport and phone cameras and video recorders, All of that functionality eventually got sucked into the iPhone. It's a really excellent example of convergence, and that convergence is the big strength of these smartphones. And when I say iPhone, you could easily substitute Android-based Samsung phones or other, whatever your favorite phone is. Right now I'm sort of reflecting on the iPhone because it's sort of the most common one. We talked about convergence before. It's great because it lets us get rid of a bunch of extra gadgets, but the drawback is that it doesn't maybe do the job as well as those dedicated tools do. But for most people, the video recorder on the iPhone, the reading of books on the iPhone, watching a show or something on the iPhone works just fine. So that's why it's become so ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. One of the things that's different about the casual phone, or excuse me, about the phone market, and I keep inflating that with casual because that's sort of the biggest part of the phone market, is that the phones get upgraded every year. And this is a very different model than what the game consoles and PCs use, right? If you invest several $100s in a graphics card on a PC, you expect that graphics card to last you 4 or 5 years. If you invest in a game console, you expect it to last 4 or 5 years. Apple has a new version of the iPhone every year, and it gets faster and faster with more memory, more processing, better graphics, better picture taking, better videos. It is a constantly iterated on product, particularly in the sense of the more recent models, the 10s and 11s or whatever number they're on. The iPhones can actually produce pretty good game graphics. And again, they don't produce 4K graphics that you get out of an Xbox One X or PS Pro or a PS4 Pro. They don't produce the ray tracing NVIDIA, 2060, 2080 line, the top of the line PC games cards. But most people don't need that, and most people don't want that necessarily. And for a lot of people, the games that you can get on the iPhone are good enough, right? And that's sort of how one reason they're so successful. I ask traditionally in class, I'd ask you how this impacts Nintendo, and I think we know the answer is that the phones have basically wiped out the dedicated portable model. You could argue that the Switch Lite, the dedicated handheld version of the Nintendo Switch, might play a role in this, but its sales are minuscule compared to that of the annual iPhone release. So it'll be interesting to see if Nintendo stays with that or if they'll stay with their more hybrid model of the traditional Switch. The iPad is again, just a tablet form factor, very similar to the iPhone. It upgrades almost every year. It was the very first successful consumer tablet. Again, uses the same touchscreen interface. The touchscreen interface is one of the big successes of these phones, right? This is even easier than the DS with its stylus, right? I don't even have to know how to write. I can just waggle my finger around and do a whole bunch of stuff. The iPad has the access to the same app store, including games, and some of the games take advantage of the more better processing power available on the iPad to have better graphics and more realistic physics and all that kind of stuff. This is the one thing that came out around 2012 that I think should have been a big wake-up call for the game industry. In some senses, it was. This was the Nielsen Marketing Industry's survey of what kids aged 6 to 12 and 13 to 18 wanted for Christmas of 2012. First things first is the iPad, right? Even among 6 years old, an iPad is in front of every traditional game console. The Nintendo Wii U is next because it was brand new. It's iPad, iPod Touch, iPad Mini, iPhone. The top 5 are all Apple devices. So again, this should have been a sort of red flag to the traditional gaming industry that big changes were happening. If you look at the teenage market, iPad, computer, tablet other than iPad, then the Nintendo Wii U, and then an iPhone. So phone, iPad, computer, another tablet computing, and the Wii U, and then way down here is the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Now, this is the end of the life cycle for those game consoles, so that's one of the reasons they're so low down. But it should still very much concern the traditional players in the game industry that the mobile phones and the mobile market is so dominant. Apps are the big thing that make the iPhone work. They're both free and paid apps available on the App Store. If you want to sell your apps on the App Store, you pay Apple a license fee of around $100. Apple takes 30% of everything you make. Several major game publishers have a presence on iPhone. Almost all of them have a either dedicated mobile in-house development team or work with smaller teams to make mobile games. Apple, much like Nintendo back in the 80s, has final say on all apps regardless of content. They can throw your app out of the App Store for any reason at any time, or just because they feel like it. The iOS is a closed system. It is a very good system. Many people like it. I used to refer to it as Steve Jobs' Velvety Prison. You can't go anywhere once you're sunk into it, but it's real nice in there. Food's good, right? Lots of apps. I mean, almost an app for anything you could think of, and lots of versions of popular games. So apps are kind of the key to the success because when you need to do something on your phone, you try to find the app that does it. And it's almost like a computer where the app possibilities are endless. And of course, in terms of games, you have almost every genre of game represented in one form or another. The App Store has a dedicated gaming section, and most of the top selling apps are games, both from established companies and smaller companies. They used to mix these together, but the games were so much a part of the top 10 all the time that basically Apple broke them off into their own category. And we'll take a little bit of a look at this on the stream for this lecture to take a look at the store and take a look at the apps. And then we'll take a look at some of the game graphics and see how they look. A lot of the mobile games rely on free-to-play or freemium model. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But essentially, the game is free to download, and then they get you to pay a little bit here and a little bit there for different things in the game. And some people really like this model, and some people really dislike it. We'll talk about kind of its strengths and weaknesses as we move on. The biggest thing to take out of this, though, is that the potential market for mobile games is so much bigger than the traditional game consoles, right? The Sony PlayStation 4 is widely seen as a very successful game console. They've shipped over 100 million consoles. Apple, by contrast, ships out 100 million phones like in a year. It's taken the PS4 6 years to get to that point. So again, the sheer size of this market and the fact that every iPhone has a credit card attached to it that makes buying as easy as I don't even have to log in. I mean, all you gotta do is hit the button, boom, new apps, new games, and that is a very powerful ecosystem. The iPad again is the same thing. It can use the things that they can run the iPhone apps. It can run games that are specifically created for it. The iPads also have more processing power and graphics capabilities than the iPad or iPhones. And so as they've switched over to the fancy displays, the graphical quality of these games is quite high. As we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, the iPhone hardware is refreshed every year. The consumers, most of us buy a new phone every couple of years on some sort of contract with AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile or whoever your cell phone provider is. And iPads follow a very similar path. And what does this do to the game industry? Well, it's almost like a never-ending arms race, right? So the game console makers can put out a very high-end game console that's very expensive, but it's attached to my big TV in my house. I can't take it with me. I can't use it to text my buddy Bob to see what we're going to do for dinner tonight. I can't use it to buy movie tickets that I carry around in my pocket. I can't use it to take pictures of my daughter when she's in the park. And the iPhone does all of those things, plus it plays games. And as a result, it dominates consumer electronics and it dominates the game industry because for most people, the games available on the mobile platforms are good enough, right? They don't care about 4K graphics. They don't care about 7.1 surround sound. They just want something to entertain themselves or their family for 15, 20 minutes at a time, or maybe even an hour at a time if the game's really good. So the Apple iPhone has sort of upended, and the smartphones by extension have sort of upended the game industry. And you'll see that reflected in the e-readings, talking about how Nintendo has been sort of spooked by Apple. There's no question that the mobile and tablet market has pretty much killed off the dedicated handheld gaming market or replaced it, however you want to look at it. And that's probably not going to come back in any meaningful way. So from there, we'll stop here for part one. We'll come back with part two and talk about the Android ecosystem and how it's a little different setup than Apple's. So remember, Apple makes their money selling you Apple hardware and taking 30% of all software that goes across the App Store. We'll compare this to Google's model, which is to be on everything possible so that you use Google services. So we'll stop there for right now and we'll pick this up in part two. All right, I hope everybody's well. Thanks.